full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. You can be seated. May the Lord bless the reading of His Word tonight. This evening I want you to think with me for a while on this thought, Paul and his contentment. Paul and his contentment. Now, he wanted for you and I to know that he was content with life. When Paul writes this and he says, I know how to do these things, he speaks of this great contentment. He also says this in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He said, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. And Paul just wants us to know this as well, that, hey, we know this. We didn't bring anything into this world. When we leave this world, whatever we have right now, we're going to leave it behind. We need to be content with some things. And you're talking about something simple, food and raiment. Food and raiment. If you've got clothes to wear, you've got food to eat, you ought to be thankful, and there ought to be a sense of contentment about that. Also, we read this in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have, for he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. And so, without any guess about it, we are to be a content people. Unfortunately, there are not very many Christians today who seem content in life. It seems that they're always anxious and worried and restless, rather than their lives being spent in an atmosphere of gratefulness and contentment. Too many times our lives are filled with whining and complaining and worry. And for us tonight, not too many people can say that I've learned whatever state I am therewith to be content. We complain sometimes about some things that to me just almost seem silly, seem foolish. Think about some of these things that we normally complain about. We complain when our children are noisy instead of being thankful that they are happy and healthy and in the right mind. We complain about our homes when many people in the world don't have a home. We gripe sometimes and complain about our work when there are those who have no jobs. We complain too often about the cars that we drive and the cars that we don't have. When there's a lot of people tonight, not only do they not have a car, they've not even seen a car. I'm going to tell you, it seems like we get caught up in those things, and all those things seem to disrupt contentment in us. Benjamin Franklin said this: contentment makes poor men rich. Discontentment makes rich men poor. And that couldn't be more true tonight, dear friend. Wealth. We have our way to judge wealth, and unfortunately, we always judge it with zeros and marks. Real wealth, though, is not judged by your bank account. It's judged by the joy that you have in life. And so contentment can add to our life. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 7 reminds us of this. The Bible says here, there is that maketh himself rich, yet hath nothing. There is that maketh himself poor, yet he hath great riches. And so the writer of Proverbs just saying there, it's not in having a lot that makes you rich. You can have very little and still be a rich individual. And too often, though, when it comes to contentment in our society, we are led to believe that contentment is had with certain success or certain substances. Someone has well said that prosperity has done more to damage the average Christian than adversity has. And it does seem that at times that we are better suited to handle adversity in life than we are prosperity. Now, I think when we read this passage of Scripture, and as we'll get into it here in a moment, we seem to kind of focus in on those parts where Paul says, you know what, I know how to be abased. And we kind of say to one another, we need to learn how to go through tough times. And we do. We absolutely have to learn that. But you know, it seems like that we have learned better how to go through tough times than we have how to succeed. And not very many Christians succeed well. And so Paul not only says, I know how to be abased, but he says, I know how to abound as well. We see that prosperity doesn't often help individuals. Surely the church of Laodicea is an example of a church that was rich, and yet the Lord said that they were poor. Again, Solomon said in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 11, he says, Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do. And behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. And so Solomon's kind of come to this conclusion. And you think about Solomon, he's supposed to be the wisest man. He was rich and very wealthy, and he says, look, I can look at all the things that I've done with my hands, and you know what he says? It's vexation. It's vexation. It seems odd to me that we work and there's things we want, we get those things, and the more things we get, the more things we've got to cause us trouble, more to worry about. Now, when you get a new car, and we like those new cars, we like the way they smell, but sooner or later the new smell is going to wear off, and if you're like me, I'm going to park in Walmart and somebody's going to rub their cart up against the door of it, and not that it's made it where you can't drive it or anything, but every time you walk by it, you look at it and almost fume. Or if you're like me, if your wife gets one, you gotta park a half a mile from Walmart before you can get there where there's nobody around. Well, we're always worrying about the things that we have. You know, contentment doesn't mean you have a lot. Now, I want to say this because I don't want to give you the wrong idea as well. Neither does contentment mean not having anything. And there are some folks that would say to really be content in life, you need to do away with everything and not own anything. Well, that's not really contentment either. Contentment neither is a lack of prosperity, and we know this: contentment surely isn't being lazy. All right. So tonight I want us to kind of look at what Paul says here when he talks about being content, and as we get into it, I want to remind you of this as Paul writes these words. He is a prisoner. He is a prisoner. He's not writing these words from a great pastorship at that time. He is not writing those words from on the heels of a great revival and great success in the ministry. He at this moment is under arrest. He is a prisoner, and yet he writes this and says, I have learned whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. Notice with me a few things in this passage. First of all, I want you to notice that there can be contentment in our substance. We need to have a sense of contentment with the things that we have, with the substance of our life. In verse 10 and then verse 12, he says this, But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but you lacked opportunity. And so Paul is thanking the church at Philippi at this time for a certain way that they had met a need in his life and how they had cared for him. Now, it reminds us of this, and when we think about our substance, if you're a believer, I don't know any other way that you can think of it than this. We have what we have at the grace of God. I mean, the Lord has been good to us and blessed us with what we have. Now, sometimes, and I think all of us may fall into this, we get to thinking about things we want and things that we don't have. Whenever you fall into that, you might just want to take a deep breath and sit back and start to think about the things that you do have. and what the Lord has given you, and start to kind of count those up. And from time to time, I do that in my own life. And what I will tell you is I always come to the same conclusion, dear friend. There is no logical reason for me to have the blessings in life that I have. The only explanation I have for it is this: God's surely been good to me. And we ought to be content with the substance that we have. Now, thinking about that, I want to remind you of a couple of things. First of all, I want to remind you of this. God knows our needs. God knows our needs. And all of us have needs in life. Now, I'm also of this mindset that most of the time we don't necessarily suffer from needs. When we are suffering discontentment, usually it is not a matter of need. It is a matter of want in our life, and we ought to be very careful about our wants. Understand this: God knows our needs tonight. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verse number 32, "For your heavenly Father knoweth that ye have need of all these things." And so He knows what our needs are, and I will tell you, He knows how to meet our needs as well. Sometimes he meets our needs directly. We think of Elijah out there on the backside of the desert, and he's out there where the Lord told him to be, nothing to eat. And the Lord sent the ravens twice a day and brought food to him, and the Lord provided for him directly. And if the Lord can provide for his need, He can provide for our needs. Now, I kind of fall out with some of these individuals that preach, you know what, if you are faithful and you do this, you do that, then you're going to have great wealth and riches. I want to tell you, of all the things that Christianity is not, Christianity definitely is not this. This is not a get-rich-quick scheme. That is not what faith is about. And the Lord has never promised that He is going to give us great riches right here. He has, however, promised us and assured us that He will take care of our needs. Now, I always think about this, and I think about it because of the way that it happened. Kathy and I were just married, and we'd been married about a year. I was in Bible college. The car that I was driving, I'm going to tell you, it was on its last leg, and we were having all kind of trouble with it. And I knew that I needed to get something else to drive. And really, buying a new car was out of the scope of things. But we did find my in-laws had a used car, and they had leased this car, and the lease was up. And it was a pretty good deal, and we thought, well, maybe we can get it. So we went to the bank to get a loan on that. Now, some of you are going to remember these days, it wasn't quite like it is now. Back in those days, it was a little more difficult to get a loan. There was a lot of questions and a lot of pressure and things, and we went in and sat down there, and they run all the numbers, and they came back and they said, well, we can do this loan, but said you're going to have $1,000 down on it. Well, I'm going to tell you something. They might as well have said $1 million. All right? They just as well said that. We got in the car and we sat down, and Kathy looked over at me, and the first words out of her mouth was this. She says, well, I don't think we're going to be able to get the car. And I said, well, you may be right. I just felt like, this was something the Lord was providing for us, and let's just pray. And we did, a simple prayer. Lord, you know what we're in need of, and you know what we have and what we don't have, and if it's your will, meet the need. So we drove from the bank, we drove home. I stopped in the driveway and I checked the mail, and guess what was in the mailbox? There was a tax refund check in the mailbox for $1,035. And so I just got in the car and just backed out. And Kathy said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to go get that car. And she said, we can't get that car. And of course, we had kind of talked coming down. We might could borrow some money from my dad, from her dad, from an aunt, and things. And I'm saying, no, we're not doing any of that. We're not doing any of that. And that I know some of you are kind of impressed. That is not the miracle of that story. The miracle of that story is this. That was back in the days when the only way that you could file your taxes was fill them out and mail them in. We had mailed our taxes in 2 weeks before that. That was the miracle. That never happened. That never happened. So what I'm telling you though is this. That was a way in our life that God met our need. And does it happen that way for us often? No, hardly ever. But I want to tell you this. There's times that God does that, and He directly meets that need. Sometimes He may use others to meet that need. And that's what had happened here in the life of Paul. I don't really know what were his expenses. We are not told that. I don't know what the need was, but I do know this. That he is thanking this church that the Lord had used them to meet whatever need this was in his life at that time. And more times than not in my life, that's the way that it's been. God's used others to meet those certain needs in our life. The point is this. However God does it, that's fine with me. We just know this. He does. He knows what we need. Now, if we know this, that God knows what we need and God meets our need, then we need to rejoice in this. We need to rejoice in the fact that God provides for us. In verse number 12, Paul is kind of rejoicing in this. He says, I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed, both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. And so Paul is somewhat rejoicing in this moment. Now, there's a few things that he says about this and his contentment. And Paul, first of all, says that he is going to be content no matter why. Now, when things go wrong in our life, too often this is the first question we ask. Why, God? Why? Now, Paul is making a statement here, and he doesn't ask the question or address the question why. He addresses the question how. He says this, I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. You know, the question really for us ought not to be, well, why is all this happening? Have you ever really logically sat down and thought about that? If we could figure out the why, I think in our mind, if we figure out the why, then somehow we're going to come up with an answer. Well, I'm going to tell you, you might find out the why and not have an answer at all. As a matter of fact, the why doesn't really matter. I remember an individual I was talking with several years ago was having this particular problem, and they were kind of stuck on this. They couldn't get beyond this. I talked to them several times, and they said something like this, and I felt it. Maybe I've even said it. If I just understood why. If I just understood why. And I just stopped, and I said, well, if you understood the why, do you think it would change what was going on here? Because what has happened has happened. It's not going to change that at all. Paul could probably spend endless hours looking to the why, but he knows that may be an unanswerable question. There is an answerable question for him, though, and that is this. It's not why, but in the midst of this, how can I do this? How can I be content? Whether I am abased or whether I am abounding, how is it that I can be content with that? So we need to be content and not worry about the why, no matter where. He goes on, he says this, I know how to do all this everywhere. Everywhere. You know, you always hear this statement. We hear this quite often. The grass is greener on the other side. And as I was studying this week, I read one thing that had a lot of those statements like that. The grass is greener on the other side. And I no more read that, and I turned on Facebook, and somebody had posted on Facebook this little statement. And the statement said this, the grass is always greener right over the septic tank. We are always looking for something better. And in our mind, we think, well, if I was here, I would be happier. If I was there, I would be happier. Paul simply says this, I've learned, it doesn't matter where I am, everywhere, I have learned to be content. Now, I think we would say this: if any man could teach us a lesson on contentment, it is the man who is a prisoner who is saying to us at this moment, I've learned how to be content with life. I know how to be content with this. And so for him, it wasn't a question of location. Everywhere, for Paul, included everywhere. In other words, he could be content in prison. He could be content on Mars Hill. He could be content in a synagogue or teaching to a church somewhere or training young pastors. Paul could be content everywhere that he was. Now here's the thing. If our contentment is finding its source in the wrong things, then what we'd have to say is this: I can't be content everywhere. I could only be content in certain places. Now, how many of you have favorite places in life? Places that you love to go to. And maybe for most of us, we don't get to spend a lot of time in those places. We're only there every so often. But when we get back to those places after we've been gone for a while, it's almost like we can just kind of sit down and just settle in and just take it all in, and we become at ease and we are content in those places. Well, I think all of us need those places for relaxation. But really, those places ought not to be our source of contentment. Contentment, if it finds its source in place or experiences, then we're going to spend the vast majority of our life discontent. And so Paul says that he was going to be content no matter why, no matter where, no matter what. He went on and said this: I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound everywhere and in all things. I've been preaching for 31 years, and I've done everything that I can do to dive into Scripture and find out the meaning of words. And there is one word there that I've always found myself trying to dig into and see, can I not get something else on that? And it is that word all. And after 31 years, can I tell you what I found that word means? That word all means all. Everything. When Paul says, I can be content in all things. Now, have you ever thought about the all of those things in Paul's life? Now, there were those who adored Paul. I mean, they would walk across broken glass for him barefooted. They loved Paul. They looked at him. Timothy looked at Paul as a father figure in the ministry. There were churches that would look to Paul and they would say, we are a church because he came to our town, our city. He preached the gospel. We were saved, and the Lord used him for that. And they loved Paul. Yet there were also folks that hated him. There were some in the church that were jealous of Paul, and whenever he would get arrested, they were glad. They would promote it and say, he can't be one of God's men. If he was, he wouldn't be getting arrested. Well, he was getting arrested because he was God's man. Well, he is simply saying this: I've learned to be content in all things. Don't raise your hand right here. Anybody here learn to be content in all things? I won't go that far. I hope I can get to that point. I think I could go this far and say I've learned how to be content in a lot of things. I've learned how to be content in a lot of things. But I want to tell you, there's still some things that get under my skin. I know y'all are not that way, but there's just some things that irritate me, that rub me wrong. And the older I get, some of these things, I'm going to tell you, you think the older you get, the better, I'll get to a point I can handle this better. What I'm finding is this: it's the exact opposite. I mean, things that used to never really bother me at all. I mean, I could see it and just kind of grin and say, well, that wouldn't be for me. And now what I find is I can't keep my mouth shut about it. I got to say something. Paul is simply saying this: look, I've learned how to be content in all things. Now, does that mean that Paul was satisfied with everything that was going on? Does that mean that Paul didn't have these natural feelings that he wished there were certain issues in his life that were better? As I thought about that, I thought about a few things that I think we could learn from Paul's life. One, I thought about the conflicts of his life. And Paul had a couple of conflicts that we are told about. One was with Peter, you'll remember. When Peter came and he was fellowshipping with those Gentile believers and everything was well, but when some of those Jewish believers from Jerusalem came and Peter separated himself from the Gentile believers, and it brought a sense of dissension in the church. Paul said this: I withstood him to his face. I want to tell you, I don't think that was easy on Paul. I don't think he's telling us that bragging so that we know, hey, Paul stood up for this. I think he's sharing with us, even though this was difficult, I did this. Paul had a close relationship with Barnabas. And you remember, it was Paul and Barnabas that were those first two missionaries that went out. And Barnabas was a great encourager to Paul. There was a time in Paul's ministry when those of the church weren't sure, should we accept Paul because of what his life had been when he was Saul. It was Barnabas that came along and took Paul under his wing and spoke up for him and encouraged people to listen to him and to trust him, and they became partners in the ministry. And that first missionary journey, things were going well, but there came a place where you remember Paul and Marcus, they got at odds, and they left. Well, the second missionary journey they started, and here's Mark again. He wants to go, and Paul says no. Now you will remember one of the last things that Paul writes when he writes to Timothy. He says, bring Mark with you also, because he's profitable for the ministry. So there had been somewhat of a mending there that had taken place, but there was that issue, and so there was this separation of Barnabas and Paul at that time. If you think that took place and that didn't bring some dissatisfaction in his life, I think you're mistaken in that. Yet what Paul is saying, that even though there were issues in his life that were not perfect, they did not bring discontentment to his life. Contentment does not mean that everything is perfect. Well, you see here our contentment, the contentment in our substance. Notice also the contentment in our situation as well. In verse number 11, Paul says this: Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. And so Paul wants them to know he appreciates what they have done for him, but he also wants them to know this: it's not. I want you to know it's not like I'm speaking out of a want here. In other words, the Lord has seen fit to take care of me. In this instance, He has used you, and Paul was thankful for that, but he did not want to sound as if he was discontent in that. As a matter of fact, he goes on and he says, I have learned to be content. When we think about the contentment of our own life, there are some things that we need to consider. First of all, I want you to consider this, that contentment is not self-satisfaction. It's not being satisfied with ourselves and who we are, being satisfied with what we have accomplished. It is not self-satisfaction. We should never settle for less than our best. All right? Let me explain that to you this way. Look, if you can be an A student, you should not settle to be a B student or a C student. You should do your best. As a matter of fact, the Bible tells us whatever it is that we do, we ought to do it heartily as unto the Lord, and that means we ought to put our best into it. Tomorrow, when you go into the workplace, whatever your work is, God's people ought to have this desire: I'm going to be the best I can be at this. Now, you may not be the best that there is, but you ought to be the best you can be at that. We ought to be giving our best, and we ought to give our all. Now, even though I give my all, my contentment in life ought not to be in my self-satisfaction. Now, we'll go home here in just a little while, and I'll go home, and I'm going to do what the guy that preached my graduation service in Bible college said for us pastors to do. And he gave us great advice. He said, men, he said, go to church on Sunday, and that's a good thing for pastors to go to church. Go to church on Sunday. Do everything you can. Preach, do everything you can. Then go home, put your pajamas on, get you a hot dog and a Pepsi-Cola, and forget all that stuff. And that's what I'll try to do after a while. And I'll have to sit there, and I'll think, as I've told you, I'll think back through the day, and I'll think about the sermons I've preached. And I always think this, okay, did I make that point correct? Did I make that point plain? And I will always kind of think through that. Now, it took me a few years, but I think back to in those first years after I'd started preaching, I don't know how Kathy stood me. Every time we'd get in the car, the first words out of my mouth would be, what did you think? What did you think? How'd I do? Did it make any sense to you? And in her kind way, she's such an encourager. She'd say, most of the time she'd say, well, it was all right. Just kept me moving, kept me going. You know, we can get to this point, though, that we think that contentment in life is based on our own satisfaction. Am I satisfied with what I'm doing? Am I satisfied with what is around me? It is not a matter of self-satisfaction. Neither is a matter of self-sufficiency as well. You know, we hear all this stuff. I mean, stuff from motivational speakers and happy preachers about how to have happiness and how to have these things in your life, and sometimes I listen to these guys and I'm thinking to myself, all that sounds good. I wish that could be, but here's the problem with that. Some of that stuff just does not relate to life. And this thing that, by the way, the church has made millionaires out of some of these guys, some of these preachers writing self-help books. If you'll follow this, you know, you'll have that. I had a lady come to me years ago, and she asked me about a certain guy in his book, and I had somehow gotten my hands on one of his books. And look, I'm not a book burner or anything like that. I read everything. I read good material. I read bad material. I just read everything. I've never read anything that I did not learn something from. But his book was the only book that I ever had, and I have a hard time throwing them away, that I put in my bookshelf backwards. I didn't want anybody to read the cover of it. All right? And she asked me about this fella, and I said, well, to be honest with you, I wouldn't buy the book. I don't want to read anything he's got to say about that. If he ever writes a book on combing your hair and brushing your teeth, I might buy that. But other than that, I'm going to stay away from him. And the reason for that is this. It was all this fluff stuff. Be a better you. Be a better you. Well, folks, there ain't that much good about us to start with. Be a better me. I think all of us would agree that there's this sense that we need to do better at certain things in life. But if it comes to this, be a better me, that's not what I need. What I need is this. I need to learn Scripture. I need to get closer to the Lord, and I need to surrender more of myself unto Him and let Him do a work in me. And so this is not about our self-sufficiency. It is self-surrender. The word that is used for Christian in the New Testament means this. It means to be self-contained. And that's what Paul is talking about here when he talks about content. The word means to be self-contained here. To be self-contained, really it came from a word that meant this. It spoke of a nation that didn't have to have any imports. They could provide for themselves. They didn't rely on any other nation for anything else. They had agriculture. They had the products that they needed. They produced themselves. They were self-contained. To be content means this. We're contained. Not in our self-satisfaction, not in our self-sufficiency, but in our surrender to the Lord. We have found, if you will, this containment in it. So he is saying to us here that there is a circumstance or a situation to our contentment. Whatever it is, if you are surrendered to the Lord, you can be content. Then the third thing tonight I want you to notice is this. Contentment, you see the contentment in our strength. And verse number 13 is one of my favorite verses in the Scripture. And I know that you probably have quoted this as well. I can do all things through Christ, which strengthened me. I can do all things through Christ, which strengthened me. And there have been times that I have faced certain circumstances that really, I didn't know how I was going to handle that. I didn't know how I was going to face that. And this verse is what I've quoted. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And it's in that moment that I just stop and I just get very honest with the Lord. And I've said to Him many times through the years, Lord, I can't do this. I can't do this on my own. And I need You. I think there are some things in this verse, some simple things that we need to notice and we need to take to heart. The first thing that I want you to notice in this verse is this. For us, it is never I can't. It is never I can't. For a Christian to say I can't is to deny this verse. And I don't know any other way about it. I don't know how many great movements for God through the years that may have been started were stopped in their shoes because someone voiced this opinion, I can't or we can't. A lot of times when there's a challenge before a church or before a committee in the church, a lot of times it gets shut down over these words. Oh, we can't do that. Before we've even prayed about it, sometimes somebody will say, oh, we can't do that. We can't do that. Well, listen, to say I can't is really to ignore the simple meaning of this verse. It does not mean, it never means I can't. But I want you to think about this. Neither does it ever mean I can. That's not what this verse means. Now, there are those that would quote this verse and say, well, the weight of this verse is on the I can. And it is not. That is the secondary part of this verse. It's not about me and it's not about you. The correct reading of this word or this verse is never I can. It's not me, it's not mine, it's not I, it's not me. Well, it is always I can through Christ. That's the weight of the verse. I can through Christ. Now, here's what I would tell you. I would ask the question, Paul, after all that he has been through by this time, how can you keep going? I mean, he's in prison. He writes 4 epistles in this prison. Paul, how can you do that? Now, folks, there have been times in my life that it seemed like the greatest burden of my life was this, because of the circumstance that I was going through at that moment, to sit down at my desk, open my Bible, and begin to study, to go and preach. And to have to go and preach in that moment, with all the pain and the issues that I was going through, it was almost more than I could bear. I would ask Paul, how is it that you are able to do this? As a matter of fact, Paul would go on to say that the Lord had used him in this setting to see that the gospel had been spread into the houses of government and leadership at that time. Paul, why would you even do that? How could you witness to those who have arrested you? How could you witness to those who have you in prison? How could you show love to them when they have shown cruelty to you? Paul, how can you do this? And his answer would be, verse number 13, I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. And folks, that is the answer for us tonight. The word that is used there for strengthen, it is a Greek word. As a matter of fact, it is a combination of 2 Greek words. One of them is the word that we are accustomed to, dunamis, power. Paul is simply saying, I can do all things through the power of God that strengthens me. That's why Paul was able to do what he could do. Now, we may not realize it sometimes, but we need the strength of Christ in our life. Anybody ever done this? You ever been tempted by something and you knew it was sin? You knew it was sin and you knew, I ought not to do this. And you didn't do it. You didn't do it. You didn't succumb to that temptation. Did that feel good? Did you kind of poke your chest out and say, well, I done good that time. I done what I should have done that time. Now, don't raise your hand right here. But anybody ever had that moment when you did not submit to that temptation, but you turned right around that same temptation and you did submit to it? What was the difference? The difference was this. In that moment, it really wasn't you as much as it was the power of Christ strengthening you. I think, we're prideful people. And we have this mindset, I can do this. I can do certain things. I can do this. We as the people of God need to realize this. We can't do it. It's not that I can, it's I can through Christ. And through Christ, that is the weight of this verse. That is the important part of this verse. Now here's what I'll tell you that is really the great part, all right? It is this, that Christ would avail himself to us. That he would make himself available to us to strengthen us to face whatever it is that we face. That's why Paul could say, I am content. True contentment is found tonight in Jesus Christ. To have this contentment this evening, the Lord requires some things in our life tonight. First of all, it is required that we must direct. There's some things that we must direct. We must direct our focus on what God has already allowed us to have. If I'm going to be content tonight, I can't always be looking at the wish list of life. You think about this time of year and Christmas, and I miss that time with small kids where they would get excited about Christmas, and we'd ask them, what do you want for Christmas? What's your wish list? Now I know things have changed, but when I was a kid, somewhere early November, mid-November, I always looked for something to come in the mail. I always looked for that Sears Roebuck catalog to come in the mail. And boy, I'd get that thing, and I'd turn it, and I'd find all the toys and stuff. And I was real subtle about it. I'd get a big pen. If there was something I really liked, I'd circle it. And I'd earmark the page so that, Mom and Dad would be sure and find it. That's our wish list. And from that time till Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, that's what my life was on. It didn't matter how many toys I had over here. My mind was focused on this hopeful stuff, pie in the sky stuff out here that I may or may not get. The Christian life, unfortunately, for many is just like that. We are constantly looking at the wish list. And, if I only had this, if I only had that, I would be content in life. I would tell you this. If you never learn to be content with what you have, you will never be content if you get the things you don't have. So we've got to direct our attention on what we have. And then we've got to disregard some things. We've got to disregard what we don't possess. In other words, put it out of your mind. Now, talking with young people, it's kind of interesting when you do this marriage counseling stuff, and people are getting ready to get married, and you talk about how th're going to live, what their life is going to be, and they go to talking about, well, when we get married, we're gonna move into a 4-story, 10,000 square foot mansion, and we're gonna have a car like Mama's got and Daddy's got, and we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. And I stop and I say, well, how long do you think it took your mom and daddy to get those things? And I talked to them and I said, well, and I'll say something like this. You have lived up to this point without those things, haven't you? And folks, when we get our mind on the things that we don't have, there's discontentment in that, and there's a question that we ought to ask ourselves, and it is this: have I lived without it? And can I go on living without it? And I've got to disregard those things that I don't have. And then we've got to do this. We've got to make a certain decision. And the decision that we've got to make is this: that we refuse to covet the things that other people have. Again, I'm using examples of kids because it's the simplest thing to do. A kid will go to school and their buddies will have a new pair of tennis shoes. And they'll run home. Oh, Jimmy's got these shoes, and I've just got to have a pair of these shoes. Well, you got a good pair of shoes. Yeah, but they're not like that. I've got to have those shoes. Well, it may seem innocent, but you understand what's at the heart of that is covetousness. And we ain't be the same way. Now, God will bless somebody in the church, and they'll get a new vehicle. And we ought, when somebody does that, you know what the correct response is? Hey, I'm glad you got a new vehicle. I'm excited you got a new vehicle. Mays Jackson told the story that one time he bought a brand new Buick. It was Carolina blue. I mean, it was a heavenly Buick. And he bought that thing, and he went to church that Sunday, and he said you could just see people. And they were all just... And he finished the sermon. He said, look, he said, I'm sorry that you're so upset that God's blessed your pastor. I've been able to get a new car. He said, but I'm going to take that thing back tomorrow. And he took it back, and the guy gave him all his money back. Well, he knew a fellow who had an old Model T. And he owned a print shop. And he said he went and bought that Model T, and he asked the guy in the print shop, he said, I want you to make me a sign to put on the back of it. And he did. And he had a sign put in the back of that car. It said, Mays Jackson's Glory Bound Special. He said the next Sunday he pulled up in the churchyard, and he blew that horn, ooga, ooga. And he got up and he said, well, I hope you saw the car that I have today. He said, now, tomorrow when you and your highfalutin friends are on Main Street of Columbia, he said, I'm going to blow that horn. He said, now don't you turn around like you don't know me. You wave at me. And he said, if some of you die, I'm going to park it right in front of the hearse, and if we can't make it into the cemetery, they can just push me in. Said that he drove that car for about 6 months, and the people finally went and talked to the chairman of deacon, and the chairman of deacon came and said, Mays, go buy you a bus, and nobody will say a word. Nobody will say a word. You know, we ought to be excited for God's people when the Lord blesses them. And if there's this sense in you that you look at the blessing of someone else and you say, well, who do they think they are? You might want to check up, because deep down inside you may be wrestling with the issue of covetousness. And so we need to make a decision, and the decision is this: just because somebody else has something doesn't mean I've got to have that. I've got to have that. And so discontentment a lot of times will come from that issue in life. It comes from focusing on the wrong things. If Paul, his contentment would have been found in the easy things of life, he would not have said from a prison cell, I know how to be content. If Paul would have only had contentment with certain experiences, it would not be while he is locked up that he would say, I've learned how to do these things. His contentment was found in Jesus alone. And all the things that we are attempting to do in our individual lives, I think it's about time that we make some room for this. Lord, I really want to be content with life. I will soon be 51 years old. I talked with I seen a guy this last week that I graduated high school with. I hardly ever run into these guys. And as I was talking to him, I thought to myself, he looks like such an old man. And he does. But we're the same age. And we got to talking about things we did when we were boys and things we did in high school. And it seems, in one way, it seems like that was yesterday. But folks, that's been 37 years ago. I mean, that time is gone. And here we are tonight. So much of life has passed by us. when are we gonna figure out that this life is too short to go through it discontented? To go through it with this sense of constant anxiousness and worry and at it all the time and never having a moment's peace. Don't you think it's about time that we get serious about this thing of being content? And of all the things that I have looked at in Paul's life, I want to tell you this is the one I've been most interested in. I'm always kind of enthralled by Paul saying, I am content. I am content. Again, Paul wasn't lazy. He was a worker. But he was content with his life. What a terrible message it sends to the world when Christians are discontent. Well, the Lord help us tonight to be content. Amen. Stand with me. Father, again, as we bow before you,